So after the OK Corral, the dust settles, you've had a big funeral for the deceased, and the tempers are still hot, and there's a month-long trial of the shooters. So, and it's this Ike Clanton who's brought charges against WYATT EARP, Doc Holliday, Morgan Earp, and Virgil are all on trial. Yeah.
They're all.
And the only person, interestingly, who does not, who doesn't take the witness stand, even Virgil on his sickbed because he was injured in the fight, even Virgil testifies. The only person who's not called to testify is Doc Holliday. That's a very interesting legal point. He's the one who's deeply embedded in the middle of all this. He saw everything. Neither side calls him. Nobody wants him on the witness stand.
The technically, of course, it was not a trial. It was a.
It was a. This is true. It was a hearing.
Hearing in justice court, which is very unusual for a hearing in justice court to last for 30 days.
For sure. Yeah.
And you had, especially when you'd already had a coroner's inquest, where there's testimony given there as well. It's an interesting story that is complicated by, again, personal things.
Mm-hmm.
The defense was put on the defensive pretty quickly in the trial because they called witnesses that that didn't portray the Earps in the best of light.
Well, they carefully picked their witnesses.
They picked their witnesses and so forth. And besides that, Will McLaury, the brother of Frank and Tom McLaury, showed up in Tombstone.
And he
was
from
an attorney.
Texas. He's an attorney from Texas.
Attorney from Texas.
And he comes there to defend, or to,
and so he
mount his.
He's not happy with the prosecution.
He wants to hang.
Yeah.
The shooters.
He wants to go after them, and he is. His letters are just filled with emotion about what he wanted to do to them, and you can tell that he has an impact on the prosecution because there is a kind of a shift that takes place. One of the difficulties that we've had for a long time was the only real an easily available account of the hearing was in the
newspapers.
The newspapers. I wish we had known, but we didn't have all those newspapers when the people first began to write it. So when they found that the Hayhurst manuscript, which was later done as a book called the OK Corral Inquest,
right, which is wonderful, and it's a transcript of the trial.
And but we don't have the original manuscripts that we know of yet. They may be somewhere. But what happens is that the Hayhurst manuscript is not chronologically accurate. In other words, the witnesses are all there, but they're not in the proper order.
And so we really don't see the repartee back and forth.
So if you read the newspaper accounts in the Nugget and in the Epitaph, you get a clearer position of what was actually taking place.
Right.
In the way the worm turns at some point.
So interestingly, WYATT Earp and Doc, the Earps and Doc both get really highfalutin attorneys to back them up. And Doc's attorney was Thomas Fitch, who was from Prescott, was friends of Gospers. And so it's intriguing to me that Doc Holliday, who's just a gambler stopping into town, who happens to run into all this, as the story usually goes, he's deeply embedded in the fight itself, and he's backed by men from Prescott government, Fitch, for instance, had helped to write the Utah state constitution. These were really well-known men. Where does he get that kind of legal backup from? And then he's never called to testify. They don't want him to say anything. And WYATT doesn't give his own testimony. WYATT does an extremely unusual thing. It was legal, but very unusual. WYATT reads about a 4-page long written testimony. And if you read WYATT's testimony, it's a legally perfect defense. Nobody speaks a legally perfect defense, and nobody with WYATT's level of we've already said, Stuart Lake said he was, illiterate. WYATT could not have written that defense. A lawyer wrote that defense, and then WYATT read it. So they had big people backing them up, which really gives a nod toward the theory that this all came to brew with more government involvement right from the start. That it was the government trying to stop this war with Mexico, and these people all got played into this story of the cattle rustlers going across the border. It all blew up. But can you think of any other reason why Doc would not be called upon to testify? They're involved, knew every detail.
Well, one of the things that you have to look at is, and where the trial really, or the hearing, where the hearing really turned was when Ike Clanton took the stand. Mm-hmm. And he started giving all of this testimony, and the defense just tore him up.
Yeah, because his wasn't written by an attorney. He's speaking his own story. And
he admitted to all sorts of things, and, mm-hmm. and talked about and told, obvious falsehoods. And it was just it was a terrible time on the stand, and from that point on, it was changed. There is a remark or two in the newspapers where it is said that that Doc Holliday was active in talking to the attorneys mm-hmm. during the hearing.
At the table. Commenting with them. Yeah, but they never called him.
That he was constantly making comments to the lawyers.
And my own feeling from looking at his life is they didn't dare put him up there, because if he had misspoken any one thing, he may have given the whole thing away.
It also was the fact that Ike made the Benson stage robbery the pivotal point for the whole fight. This was the cause of the whole thing, and he made it all turn on that. And that shifted the balance entirely.
Again,
and he made such a fool of himself on the stand that you can see, almost literally, the change in the attitude, even in the attitude of Spicer. Everybody always accuses Spicer of being favorable to the Earps, but if you read the testimony in the correct chronological order, you can see that he is doing all sorts of things that seem supportive of the prosecution in the beginning, and then at some point, all of a sudden, Spicer's is taking a different line. And it's because of the quality of the testimony that's being given.
Absolutely, and so at the end of a month, Spicer's ruling on this is that he's not going to bring charges. Now, he says it can be turned over, there's going to be a grand jury meeting. If they'd like to consider it again, he'll leave it to them. So they walk at the end of a month. And now you've still got Ike Clanton, who was mad from the start. Now he hasn't got his people, and Will McLaurin write the same thing. So Ike tries again to bring other charges in another town. That doesn't go through. So the Cowboys are still mad, and there begins to be some vengeance back, some payback from the Cowboys. So in December, it's right after Christmas. What happens in a saloon?
Well, he was actually walking down the street. He had left the saloon.
Right.
And was walking down the street.
This is Virgil.
And this was Virgil Earp, and he was ambushed by several men in an unfinished building.
And some modern writers, because they want to put all the focus on WYATT, say, oh, they must have thought it was WYATT. No, they were mad
They
at
were
all
mad
the
at
Earps.
all the Earps.
Yeah.
It didn't matter which one it was.
Exactly. So
If you take out one, that's one less you got to deal with.
exactly. So he's maimed. His arm is shot to pieces, and he never really has good use of his arm again.
Yeah, they said that later on when he recovered and was still doing law enforcement work, that he didn't have an elbow, and that when he would ride a horse, his arm would flop.
It's amazing. It's actually amazing he recovered from that injury. And then in March of the fight, and then things are still brewing with the Cowboys. They're still not done. They're still not. There's threats being made. Holliday and Johnny Ringo actually come to blows in the street,
Yeah.
and have to be backed off from that. Do you want to talk briefly about Holliday and Johnny Ringo? And the interesting relationship between these two?
Well, they're in keeping it. I'm going to really get into some things about between the two of them, but there are some things that are directly related to Doc that
Right.
That seem to be relevant. First of all, while the hearing was going on, Kate suddenly leaves Tombstone and says later that she received
$50.
$50 from John Ringo and she talks about, she says things about in a way that sound almost romantic that she never said about Doc in any place in any of her recollections.
She talked about his coloring, Ringo's coloring, and his fine mustaches, and how she just thinks about him, and it almost makes her weep to think about him.
Yeah.
Very tender emotions. And it's possible that Ringo knew Kate and Holliday both in Fort Griffin, because Holliday had said that Ringo was part of that old Fort Griffin crowd. And they were both there. So there's some history maybe there.
Yeah.
So these two come to blows in the middle of a street. And the movie Tombstone shows that Ringo was gunning for Wyatt in the street, and Holliday comes in and rescues him, and he says, "I'm your Huckleberry. That's, fighting's just my game." We don't know that Holliday actually ever said, "I'm your Huckleberry." It was a very common phrase at the time. And for those who think that it means, "I'm your hucklebearer, I'm your casket bearer," there was no such phrase. "I'm your Huckleberry" was in newspapers all over the country at the time, and it meant, I'm the man for the job. So,
if you need something done, I'm your Huckleberry.
Holliday may have said it.
I'm the man for you.
Yeah, he may have said it, and if he didn't say it, he probably should have said it. But so they come to blows in the middle, or they come to a little confrontation, which wasn't Holliday supporting Wyatt. It was literally just Holliday and Ringo.
It was a standoff between the two of them.
Right.
It was a personal, and it could have had more to do with Kate than it did with Wyatt.
Well, especially since they, was it Ringo who said he had a scarf, and they just, all I need is 10 paces out in the street. These are old dual terminologies that they were using.
Terminology.
Yeah, so that's an interesting sidebar. So that's January. So along comes, and tensions are getting higher. There's an attempt made on the mayor's life as he's out on the road. So the Cowboys are still active. And then March. It's the day before Wyatt's birthday, and there's a show in town, an interesting traveling group with a lead actor who does female impersonation mostly. So it was a hilarious group, and they'd all gone to see the show, and Wyatt goes home, and Morgan and Doc go off to go do something else after, and then Doc goes home, and then Morgan decides he wants to go play some pool, and so Wyatt goes to keep him company. You want to tell the story of March 25th.
Well, it was late at night. They were shooting pool. Wyatt was sitting up against the wall, leaning back in a chair, and Hatch and the owner and Morgan are talking, and at one point, Morgan bends over the table to take a shot and all of a sudden there is gunfire that bursts through the windows, the back windows, into the room. One bullet hits the wall close to Wyatt's head, and other bullets strike Morgan, who falls forward onto the pool table.
Shot in the back.
And shot in the back. And he is, there is an immediate, flurry of activity. Some of them trying to get outside to see if they can find out who it was and where they went and so forth. But the Morgan is dying. He doesn't last for very long. At one point, after they've got him stretched out, he says, straighten my legs. My legs aren't straight, or something to that effect. And
they were.
And they were. They were laid out, and Wyatt and he spoke to each other.
And we don't know what they said.
We
There's
really
been
don't know
several
what they
different
said.
accounts of what it was.
There
Morgan's
are
famous
several
last
accounts.
words.
I always liked the one that Lake to be told about. I liked the story about how he and Morgan used to argue about death.
Right.
And he believed in an afterlife, and that before people died, they saw. Morgan said they see a light. And so that story ends that all Morgan said was, "You were right, Wyatt. I don't see a damn thing."
Well, there's that story, and then there's the other one where he says, "You get him for me, Wyatt."
Yeah.
So we don't know. We don't know
what
they
exactly
said.
he said, but this was the beginning. Now you have to remember too that Wyatt and Virgil made an effort earlier, before this happened, to turn down the temperature. They made an appeal directly to Ike Clanton. Let this be over with.
Ike was not willing. Ike wanted vengeance for his father and now for his brother.
And he wrote, and they wrote a letter of resignation as Deputy United States Marshals, because when Virgil was injured, Wyatt was appointed to take his position.
And Crawley Dake did not accept the resignation, isn't that right?
That's right. Crawley Dake would not accept the resignation.
So he's still a deputy U.S. Marshal.
He's still a
Wyatt
deputy
is.
U.S.
And anybody he calls to aid him is a de facto assistant.
Yeah, he would be officially, at the very least, be what they called a posse man.
Exactly, working under a federal
officer.
They
heard, they got testimony that indicated that Frank Stillwell and Pete Spence and the one that's usually referred to as Indian Charlie, but
Florentino Cruz.
Yeah.
And that this was information that came from Marietta Spence, who was Frank's wife, and that he'd been beating her, and so she told the story.
So this is the beginning of what is known as the vendetta.
And it didn't start as a vendetta. They'd been killed, and again, I understand, I don't like Ike, but I understand his motivation. If you think somebody's had something to do with the death of your father, and then they gunned down your brother, he's going to see it to the end. So they take, the Earps have to get out of there. They send the women back to California because there's wives there. They send them back to California, and Virgil, who's maimed, and his wife go to escort Morgan's body back to California. Why back to California? Because the Earp family has moved from Iowa. They've actually gone back and forth a couple of times, and they're now living in Southern California. So they want to take the train, but getting to the train means you've got to take a wagon or a stagecoach to the town of Contention, and then you can take a short train from Contention, and then you got to take another part of a stagecoach. They're all over the place, but they're going to eventually end up in Tucson at the train yard. So Morgan's body is on the train in Tucson. Virgil is there, Allie Earp is there, and they are very, very guarded by Wyatt and Doc and the men that Wyatt have called to be his de facto posse. So now they may not have been sworn in as deputies, but they are his posse to guard them. And when they get to the train station, Doc surrenders a couple of guns to the officer who's at the train station, so they're not walking around the train depot. and they guard they guard Virgil and Allie as they go to have some dinner before they get on the train. There was a restaurant right there at the train yard, a new restaurant. Now this was on the night, according to Kate, this was on the night that the city of Tucson was very first lit by electric lighting. And an interesting aside to that is that when the newspapers were talking, and the talk about the lighting had been going on for weeks, because the gas company had been advertising, if you run a line, then you get a free globe, and then the newspapers reported that this light thing may prove more of a hindrance than a help to us. There may come a time when we realize that we have too much light and that darkness is important to us too. And interestingly, Tucson has some of the most strict lighting ordinances in the country now, because they have observatories up in the mountains. So they have very strict lighting ordinances. But on this night, the city was celebrating the first lighting, and the first lights were around the courthouse. So there was gunfire going off around the town and fireworks to celebrate the lighting. So that's the atmosphere when Doc and company are escorting now Virgil and Wyatt back to the train, and they go to pick up their guns because they're going to now go on their way back to Tombstone. And Wyatt is told that somebody has spotted two men skulking around in the train yard, and he suspects that it's Frank Stillwell and Ike Clanton. And he doesn't catch Ike, but he catches Frank.
Frank Stillwell.
Yeah, and they know that they're threatening. They know they're a threat. They're there not for good.
This is not often pointed out, but when they reached contention on their way there, the one-armed, let's see, what was his last name? Evans, he was the chief deputy and had his office as, he was Dake's chief deputy, and he had his office in Tucson. And so they met at contention, and Evans told Wyatt that he believed that they were that Frank was going back to Tucson, and Evans also testified later that that he saw them get off of the train when they were going to have dinner, and that Doc Holliday got off the train carrying two shotguns.
Right.
And so this is anyway. They catch him. They catch Frank, and it does appear that vengeance took over in the mind of Wyatt Earp, because Frank was shot up pretty badly.
He said Wyatt, in his own stories of it, he says that Frank grabbed a hold of his shotgun, and he opened fire on him, begged for his life, and he opened fire on him anyway. And Wyatt took total credit for that. But according to the man who owned the restaurant there, who found Frank's body the next day, he said he'd never seen a man so bad shot up. And according to the coroner, he was shot everywhere, meaning they all fired at him, all of the men in the posse. And Holliday always, ever after that, when he was asked about that, he would use exactly the same legally appropriate phrase. I know that he was a stagecoach robber and a murderer, Frank Stillwell, but I do not know that I had anything to do with this death. That's called plausible deniability, which is why we have a firing squad. So, they saw Wyatt kill him, and none of them wanted Wyatt to have to take the fall for that. So they all fired into him, and they all emptied their guns, and there's Frank Stillwell dead, and Ike's got away. And the train goes off, and Wyatt and Doc and the rest head back to Tombstone, and Doc must not have been suffering from consumption at this point, the way he's always portrayed in the movies, where he barely can get out of bed.
Yep.
Because it was a 9-mile, they had missed the train that went down to the next, they'd missed that train stop. So they had to walk 9 miles to Watervale, which is the next place the train was going to pick him up to take him down to Benson. So Holliday walked 9 miles that night.
Well, I think the whole what they call the Vendetta ride proves that Doc was in better health than he had been when he left Dodge City, for example. And
nobody in Tombstone ever mentioned his health. None of the stories talked about his health.
Well,
so, he wasn't in bad health at that time.
But it was yet another town that had a spa close by.
Yes, it did. Glendy King's spa out close to Henry Hooker's ranch. Yeah, there was a spa up in the mountain, so he may have gone there to use that. So, in the Vendetta ride, how many people did they actually kill in the Vendetta ride that followed that?
Oh, well, we know that they killed, in addition to Frank Stillwell, they killed Florentino Cruz, and we know that it's possible. I really can't make an argument about this, although I think Bozenecker makes some references. There are some things that indicate that there may have been people that we don't know about that were just left out in the brush. But
could have been
the most important deal. They go back to, and what's interesting to me is that while this Vendetta ride is going on, the Earps go in and out of Tombstone several times, and even when he makes that famous departure where Bean tries to arrest him, and
you've seen me one too many times.
You've seen me one too many times, and they ride off, and it's after this that we have the Cottonwood Springs incident, or where Curly Bill was. To this day, that's one of the biggest arguments.
That he survived.
But I'm inclined to believe, here's what I believe, because of the consistency of accounts given by people who were on that ride. They shot somebody. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not he died, I don't know. But he...
Henry Hooker said to them, "I heard you killed him. I'm glad you did."
And Wells Fargo, not only that, but Wells Fargo also paid the Earps for for Curly Bill's death.
Yeah, and that's mentioned actually in a document that we have.
In the Wells Fargo records.
Yes.
So he shot somebody there. It's we've been to 2 or 3 locations that are supposed to be there, but the one location that I always, first time I'd been to 2 or 3 different locations out there, but we went to this one place that is Cottonwood Springs, I think. That when we got there and we're walking in the direction we were supposed to go, I began to say,
this is it.
This is all the right terrain. This is everything like it's described by Wyatt and by Doc and by others who were, because and then all of a sudden I was walking next to Casey Tiefertiller, and we topped this little ridge and looked down, because they say it, that everybody was surprised.
Yes.
Because they weren't expecting these people to be where they were.
Right.
And all of a sudden,
they just came down to water their horses.
They were just coming in, and they topped that ridge, and when they topped that ridge, they saw all these men down there.
Yeah, and the men saw them,
and
so
the
they
men
had
saw
to
that
engage.
and started firing.
The wonderful story about Wyatt walking on water, Holliday himself said it was absolutely miraculous that Wyatt got out of that, and Wyatt defenders say, look how brave Wyatt was. He stood there by himself and shot. But according to Holliday, what happened, they came down, they came upon these people without knowing they were going to, and they all tried to get out of there. And Wyatt he was already started to dismount, and his gun belt had slipped down. Mm-hmm. And he said he couldn't get it back on. And so he's stuck with this belt around his hips. Now, how stupid do you feel? Standing there stuck because, your belts are hanging down and you can't move. You can't get back on your horse. But Doc and the rest thought that Wyatt was with them. And they got a certain way and turned around and realized he wasn't. Mm-hmm. So they went back, and Doc said then he got to see Wyatt down there taking on all of these guys, and he would have been there with them if he could have been. And he said it was absolutely miraculous. He said if God himself hadn't been on our side, then Wyatt would have died that day. So, Doc didn't say he walked on water, but he said it was miraculous that Wyatt Earp had escaped.
I hope there are some other stories that have kind of verified that that there was a fight. Even the two men that were supposed to be taking money to WYATT from Tombstone, that went to the camp, and it was apparently after the fight was over, and they pretended like they didn't say we were looking for WYATT EARP'S party. They just got in and fell in. How you boys doing? And they just sat down and
wandering through the canyons that day.
But there is one story that Wells Fargo supposedly investigated, where he was mortally wounded, and that they put him in a wagon from the local rancher there, and they carried him out back to Frank Patterson's ranch, I think. But they carried him back to out there, and that's where that he died actually there, and that he was buried there.
And if we said this is Curly Bill Brocious, just in case we, left that name out, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Curly Bill Brocious, and it was and they go back to Tombstone yet again, to the outskirts of Tombstone, and have another conference or two with the local people who are supporting them. Mm-hmm. And by this time, what's happened is that there is a combination of people that are mining people, Wells Fargo, even the Santa Fe Railroad,
right,
is contributing money to support the Earps in this war.
Well, the Southern Pacific that went through Tucson was part of that. The Southern Pacific was the railroad that took the money out of Tombstone. Yeah. They didn't want the rustlers and the gamblers or the outlaws down there either. So, like, all the business forces are supporting them in this.
Yeah, and I think that's one part of the story that's not been investigated thoroughly enough, because I suspect there are some more records out there that indicate the extent to which, because all these guys know about it, the people who were supporting them. Mm-hmm. It's like this whole deal is a known fact that this is going on.
Well, think about it. Washington even knows about it. This is trouble. It's causing trouble with Mexico. It's disrupting the economy of the whole place. The country is relying on the silver that's coming out of these camps, and the railroads are building across the country because of the money that's coming out of the silver camps and for the money they're getting paid to take the silver out of the camps. So this is the whole country business in one way or another is involved in this. So they would be supportive. So as they finally do make their escape, and they're going to have to leave the Tombstone area, and they're making their escape. They go across Henry Hooker's property. Henry Hooker, biggest cattleman in Arizona, gives them a safe hideout for a while. The commander of the army post at I was going to say Fort Griffin.
No,
Fort Grant. Fort Grant. Fort Grant kind of gives them free. He says, "I have to hold you here, but I've got to go take care of something. Oh, and there's some fresh horses over there." So he lets them get out of town. And so they are helped as they get out of the Arizona territory.
Helped by the military. And of course, before it's all over, the president issues a proclamation authorizing action.
Yeah, so they are helped to get out of there.
They've got from the almost from the beginning, they have the support.
Yes,
it's time for us to end this, is basically what businessmen and government agencies were saying.
Right.
Let's finish this.
So you would think then that Doc and WYATT, having done this great thing together, and now they've escaped, and now they're in New Mexico, and they're moving on to get to safe territory, they have a falling out in Albuquerque. You want to share the Manny Otero story, and then we'll move on to Colorado.
It's an interesting story. Doc and WYATT have been close, and but again, they get to Albuquerque, where agents for the Santa Fe Railroad and and Wells Fargo and Company are present, including the president of Wells Fargo. But it turns out that Wyatt apparently moves uptown in a private home while he's there, whereas Doc and the rest are staying in a hotel somewhere. Now, there have been two basic stories that have predominated in this falling out. One is that Doc accused Wyatt of wearing a metal vest in some of the fights.
Which is the way Doc said it was miraculous that he didn't die. And that's a story told by Kate. That's not the story made up by some Laura person. I mean, but it's a Kate story, whether or not it's true. It comes from Kate.
Then we found the other document which says, when they got to Albuquerque, that the man that Wyatt stayed with was Henry Jaffa.
Right, a Jewish merchant.
Jewish merchant, prominent Jewish merchant. And they talk about how Jaffa replaced his coat that had been shot up in the Curly Bill fight.
And at his door, he had a mezuzah.
And he had a mezuzah,
which is a symbol of praying to God as you come in and go out of your door.
Well,
and Jewish homes have the mezuzah, and you know briefly pay honor to the mezuzah as you're coming in and out. And Wyatt knew how to do that.
And the reason that Wyatt knew how to do that was somebody we've not talked about yet.
Yeah, that's true. I guess we're not going to talk about her hardly.
We forgot about her, but
Sarah Josephine Marcus.
Sarah Josephine Marcus,
who was
who was a Jewish woman and an actress and whatever.
And whatever, she may have been some whatever too. And she's the Josie in all the stories that we see.
But Wyatt never called her Josie.
No.
Josie, he called her Sadie. And
and she was Jewish.
And she was Jewish, and apparently Doc made in this account, Doc made some remark about Wyatt and his Jewish woman.
Or Wyatt being a Jew boy, he called him, which sounds terribly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, he's
but
a Jew boy.
It's kind of really more about, I was your bestie and now she's your bestie, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So again, something more personal going on there with their feelings.
And then, so at that point,
there was a split.
at that point, Doc Holliday and Dan Tipton left the rest.
Right, and moved on up to Colorado. And we're going there next.
Okay.